The day she told me she was leaving, she smiled like I was already a memory, and that was the moment I realized some endings don't arrive with noise, they arrive with silence, so precise it feels rehearsed. My name is Ethan Carter, and if you had seen my life from the outside, you would have called it stable, maybe even lucky, a modest home in a quiet Michigan suburb, a steady job in systems consulting, a routine built on early mornings, coffee at 6:30, and the kind of predictable evenings most people stop appreciating until they lose them. Olivia and I had been married for 8 years, and for a long time I believed stability was enough, that love could survive on shared bills, shared space, and shared history. But somewhere along the way I stopped noticing when laughter became shorter, when conversations became transactional, when her eyes started drifting past me instead of meeting mine. It didn't happen all at once, it never does. It was gradual, like winter settling into a house you forgot to insulate, and I told myself it was just stress, just work, just life getting heavier. Olivia used to talk about our future like it was a place we were building together, but lately she talked about other people's futures more than ours, especially men she saw in articles, at events, men who built companies, who moved fast, who lived in a world I was no longer part of. I remember one night at dinner, she casually mentioned someone named Daniel Brooks, a name that would later feel heavier than it should, describing him as driven, confident, someone who understood opportunity, and I remember nodding like it didn't matter, like I didn't feel something subtle shift in the room between us. I worked, I provided, I kept things steady, but I also stopped being exciting, and in the quiet spaces of our marriage, I think she started confusing stability with stagnation. The first real crack appeared not in a fight, but in a comment she made while folding laundry, saying life was supposed to feel like it was going somewhere. And I remember pausing for a second too long before asking her what she meant, and she just smiled faintly and said nothing specific, which was worse than an argument because it left room for thoughts neither of us said out loud. After that, things became carefully polite, like two people maintaining a shared apartment rather than building a shared life, and I started noticing how often she was on her phone, how often she was out a little later than usual, how she would talk about meetings that didn't require details, only time. Still, I didn't accuse, I didn't question, because trust is a habit you don't realize you're breaking until it's already gone, and I had spent years believing that patience was the same thing as strength. Then came the evening that changed everything. The evening she asked me to sit down at the kitchen table, even though nothing about it felt like a normal conversation. No dinner, no casual tone, just that careful expression people wear when they've already made a decision and are only waiting for words to catch up. She told me she had been thinking for a long time, that she needed something different, something more aligned with the life she imagined for herself. And I remember the exact way she avoided my eyes when she said it, like looking directly at me would make it harder to continue. There was no shouting, no accusation, just a calm declaration that our marriage was ending, and that she had already decided to move forward separately. I asked her if there was someone else, not because I wanted a dramatic answer, but because I needed something concrete to hold on to, and she hesitated just long enough for silence to become its own answer before she said there was someone who understood where she was going in life. His name was Daniel Brooks. And in that moment, I didn't react the way people expect. I didn't beg. I didn't argue. I didn't raise my voice. I just sat there watching the life I thought I understood reorganize itself without me, like I had already been edited out before the final draft was even printed. She said she was sorry, but it sounded like something you say after choosing a destination that no longer includes another person. And when she stood up from the table, I realized she wasn't asking for permission. She was informing me of something already in motion. That night, I didn't sleep, not because I was angry, but because my mind kept trying to locate the exact point where we stopped being us and became two separate directions sharing the same space. And somewhere in that silence, I began to understand that endings don't always destroy what you built. Sometimes they just reveal who was already planning to leave it behind. After that night, nothing changed in a loud way, but everything changed in the way a room changes when you realize someone has already been moving furniture while you were asleep. Olivia stayed in the house for a while, but it felt more like timing than presence, like she was waiting for the right logistical moment rather than sharing space with me. She still made coffee in the mornings, still asked practical questions about bills and schedules, still moved through routines we had built together, but the emotional weight behind each action felt lighter, as if she had already emotionally packed what mattered to her and was simply finishing what remained. I noticed she started dressing differently, not in an obvious way, but in subtle recalibration, more intentional, more aligned with the version of herself she seemed to be constructing in her mind, and I would sometimes catch her looking at her reflection longer than necessary, as if confirming she was becoming someone else. She did not mention Daniel Brooks again directly, but his presence did not need to be spoken to exist. It showed up in fragments, in conversations that drifted toward ambition, opportunity, and people who moved forward without hesitation. Phrases she never used before, as if she had borrowed vocabulary from a world I had not been invited into. One evening, she came home later than usual, placed her keys on the counter, and told me she had been at a networking event, her tone casual, almost rehearsed, and I nodded like I had accepted the shape of a life that was no longer asking for my participation. I asked no questions, not because I believed everything was fine, but because I had learned that questions no longer functioned as bridges between us, only as reminders of distance. The house itself began to feel segmented, like two people, occupying parallel versions of the same space, each respecting boundaries that were never formally agreed upon but deeply understood. I would hear her on phone calls in the other room, her voice shifting into something more animated, more confident, a version of her that did not exist when she spoke to me, and I realized I had stopped being the person she rehearsed her thoughts with. At work, I found myself distracted by small gaps in focus, moments where I would stare at a spreadsheet or a meeting agenda and realize I had been thinking about silence instead of numbers, about the absence of explanation instead of the structure of my day. People around me did not notice anything outwardly wrong, because there was nothing dramatic to see, only a man who had become quieter in places he used to be automatic. Then came the first real fracture in routine, a Friday evening when she told me she was going out for dinner and would be back late, and I remember how easily she said it, as if informing me of weather conditions rather than shaping the architecture of our separation. I stayed home that night, not out of protest, but because there was nowhere else to go that felt different from where I already was. Around 9:30, I opened my laptop and tried to focus on work I did not need to finish that night, but my attention kept drifting toward the quiet hum of the house, toward the realization that I was no longer waiting for her to come home in the way I used to. I was waiting only for confirmation of patterns I already understood. She returned closer to midnight, keys soft against the counter, movements careful, almost considerate, like someone trying not to disturb a life they were already exiting. She did not offer details, and I did not ask, and in that mutual silence there was a kind of agreement neither of us had spoken aloud. A few days later, I saw her phone on the kitchen counter, screen lighting up with a notification preview that included a name I already knew without needing to fully process it, Daniel Brooks, and I felt nothing immediate, no shock, no anger, just a strange clarity, like recognizing a shape that had been forming in the background for a long time. That evening, she mentioned him briefly in conversation for the first time, not as a confession but as context, describing him as someone who understood momentum, someone who did not hesitate when making decisions, and she said it with a tone that made it sound like a comparison she did not realize she was making. I listened without interrupting, because I had begun to understand that interruption would not change direction, only noise. And when she finished speaking, she simply moved on to another topic as if nothing significant had been revealed. But I sat there longer than necessary after the conversation ended, realizing that the distance between us was no longer theoretical. It was structured, consistent, and quietly expanding. And somewhere in that realization, I understood that what I was witnessing was not confusion or indecision, but alignment. She was already orienting herself toward a life where I was no longer the reference point, only the origin she had decided to move away from. The moment everything shifted did not come with warning or spectacle. It came in the form of a name spoken casually in a room that suddenly felt smaller than it should have. It was a Thursday evening when Olivia came home later than usual, the kind of late that no longer required explanation between us, and I was standing in the kitchen reviewing work emails I was not truly reading when she placed her keys down and began talking about her day. Her tone was lighter than it had been in weeks, almost energized, as if something outside our home had begun to restore a version of her I no longer had access to. and she mentioned an event downtown, a business gathering where people discussed opportunities rather than obligations, and I nodded while keeping my attention low, as if I had accepted that her world and mine no longer needed to overlap. Then she said his name again, Daniel Brooks, not dramatically, not as a revelation, but as if he were simply part of her environment now, someone whose presence required no introduction or justification, and I noticed the way she said it without hesitation, like it had already become familiar language. She explained he had been speaking at the event, discussing growth strategies and investment cycles, and the way she described him was not romantic or emotional, but something more subtle, admiration framed as observation, respect framed as neutrality. I asked no questions because I already understood that questions no longer reached anything meaningful between us. They only marked the distance more clearly, and she continued speaking as if my silence was agreement rather than absence. Later that night, after she went upstairs earlier than usual, I stayed in the kitchen longer than necessary, not doing anything important, just existing in the quiet that followed her departure from the room, and I realized that silence had become the most consistent form of communication in our house. The following days carried a new pattern, one that felt less like deterioration and more like redirection, as if our marriage was no longer breaking apart, but being carefully reassigned into separate trajectories. Olivia began receiving calls more frequently, stepping outside or into another room to take them, her voice shifting into a sharper focus that I rarely heard when she spoke to me, and each time she returned, she would carry a slightly different emotional temperature, as if adjusting herself back into our shared space required conscious effort. I found myself paying attention to details I used to ignore, the way she checked her phone before answering questions, the way she sometimes paused mid-sentence as if mentally switching contexts, the way she stopped asking about my day in any meaningful way. One evening, I came home earlier than expected and found her sitting at the dining table reviewing something on her tablet, her expression concentrated, and when I asked what she was looking at, she said it was market-related research, something about business expansion trends, and she said it smoothly enough that I almost accepted it without thought, until I noticed the name Daniel Brooks referenced in a document header before she tilted the screen away. She did not acknowledge that moment, and I did not pursue it, not because I believed there was nothing to pursue, but because I was beginning to understand that truth in our situation did not reveal itself through confrontation. It revealed itself through accumulation. That night, I went to bed later than her, lying awake while she slept beside me in a way that felt increasingly like shared space rather than shared life. And I thought about how relationships do not usually end in sudden collapse. They end in gradual redistribution of emotional investment until one person is left managing what the other has already emotionally exited. A few days later, Olivia told me she needed to make some changes in her life, that she had been reflecting on what direction she wanted her future to take, and she spoke with a calmness that suggested the decision had already been processed internally long before it reached me. She said she felt she had outgrown certain limitations, though she did not define what those limitations were, and I understood without needing clarification that I was included in that category, not as an enemy, but as a structure she no longer saw as expandable. I listened without interrupting, because by then I had learned that interruption only created friction without altering outcome, and when she finished, she simply stood up and continued with her evening as if she had delivered information rather than initiated change. That same week, I saw Daniel Brooks mentioned again indirectly, this time through a message preview that appeared on her phone while it rested on the counter, and I remember how ordinary the moment looked from the outside, just a screen lighting up briefly, but internally something settled into place that had been forming for some time. I did not pick up the phone, I did not ask for explanation, because by then explanation had become irrelevant to the structure of what was already unfolding. Instead, I began noticing the absence of uncertainty in her behavior, the way she moved through decisions without hesitation, the way she spoke about the future as something already partially arranged. And in that realization, I understood something I had been resisting, not that she might leave, but that she had already begun living in the version of life where I was no longer a central participant, only a reference point she was moving away from with increasing certainty. The night she asked me to sit down at the table again, I already knew before she spoke that something irreversible was about to be said, not because she looked different, but because she no longer looked uncertain. Olivia moved with a kind of quiet finality that evening, placing her phone face down on the counter, pouring herself a glass of water she did not drink, and sitting across from me with her hands folded in a way that felt rehearsed rather than natural. The house was silent except for the faint sound of the refrigerator cycling on and off, a sound that suddenly felt too ordinary for what was about to happen. She told me she had been thinking for a long time, that she needed clarity, direction, and a life that matched who she was becoming, and she said it without emotional spikes, without hesitation, as if she had already practiced the version of this conversation that would cause the least resistance. I listened without interrupting, not because I agreed, but because I had learned that interruption did not change the outcome, it only changed the tone. Then she said the words I was already expecting but still not prepared to hear, that she wanted a divorce, and that she had already made up her mind. There was no apology attached to it in any meaningful way, only a softened delivery, like someone trying to minimize the friction of a decision already finalized elsewhere. I asked her when she decided this, and she paused briefly before saying it was not one moment, but a realization over time, and I understood that phrase better than I wanted to, because it meant the decision had been living inside her long before she allowed me to see it. When I asked if there was someone else, she did not answer immediately, and that silence was longer than anything she had said so far. And when she finally spoke, she confirmed there was someone she had grown close to, someone who understood where she was heading in life, and she did not need to say his name for me to know it was Daniel Brooks. The air in the room did not change dramatically. Nothing broke, nothing fell, but something structural shifted in the way I experienced everything around me, as if the house itself had reclassified me as temporary. I did not argue. I did not raise my voice, because at that point I understood that emotional reaction was not part of the equation she was operating from. Instead, I asked a simple question about logistics, about how she imagined the next steps, and she responded with organized clarity, as if she had already mapped it out in phases rather than emotions. She said she would likely stay with a friend for a while, that we would need to handle legal arrangements, and that she wanted everything to remain respectful, a word she used carefully, as if respect could be preserved through structure even after connection had already dissolved. I nodded through most of it, not because I was indifferent, but because I was observing something that no longer felt like an argument between two people, but the execution of a plan that had been finalized elsewhere and was now being implemented in my presence. When she finished speaking, she stood up and thanked me for understanding, and that phrase lingered in the air longer than anything else she had said, because it assumed understanding was already complete, when in reality I was only beginning to process the fact that I had been removed from the center of a life I thought I was still building. That night, after she went upstairs, I remained at the table longer than necessary, staring at the space where she had been sitting, noticing how quickly absence can become the dominant presence in a room. I did not feel anger in the way people often describe it. There was no immediate explosion of emotion, only a slow recognition that the version of our life I had been participating in no longer existed in the same form for her. Somewhere in that silence, I realized that the most significant part of the conversation was not what she said, but how long she had already stopped needing me to say anything back. After that conversation, the house stopped feeling like a shared space and started feeling like a carefully divided map where neither of us had officially marked the boundaries yet. Olivia began moving through the days with quiet efficiency, and I began doing the same, as if we had both unconsciously agreed that emotional discussion had reached its limit and what remained was only procedure. The next morning, she was already up before me, standing in the kitchen with a travel mug in her hand, reviewing something on her phone while the sunlight came through the window in a way that made everything look too normal for what was happening between us. She told me she would be staying elsewhere for a while, that she needed space to think clearly, and she said it without hesitation, like the decision had already been tested and approved in her mind long before she presented it aloud. I nodded and told her I understood, even though understanding was not the same as agreement, and she seemed to accept that response as sufficient. There was no argument about who would leave first or how quickly things needed to be separated, only a quiet coordination of logistics that replaced what used to be conversation. Over the next few days, she began gathering a few personal items, not in a dramatic packing session, but gradually, as if erasing her presence from the house one category at a time rather than all at once. I would come home from work and notice small absences first: a framed photo no longer on the shelf, a few articles of clothing missing from the closet, the bathroom counter slightly emptier than it had been the day before. Each change was subtle enough to avoid confrontation, but together they formed a pattern that was impossible to misinterpret. We spoke mostly about practical matters now: insurance details, shared accounts, and timelines, and every conversation carried a strange neutrality, as if we were two professionals completing a joint project that had reached its final phase. At one point, she asked if I had thought about where I would stay once everything was finalized, and I told her I had not decided yet, which was true, because I had not yet fully accepted that there was a version of my life where I would be living somewhere else entirely. She accepted that answer without comment, and we moved on to discussing paperwork again, as if emotion had been permanently removed from the equation. One evening, I found myself alone in the living room after she had gone out, sitting in the same chair where we used to watch television together, and I realized I could not remember the last time we had actually watched something without both of us being partially distracted by something else. The silence in the house was no longer uncomfortable. It was structured, almost organized, like it had been assigned a purpose. A few days later, I received an email from her outlining preliminary separation terms, written in a tone that was professional enough to feel like it came from someone else, and I read through it slowly, noticing how efficiently a shared life could be converted into categories, numbers, and responsibilities. There was no hostility in the document, only clarity, and that clarity was almost more disorienting than anger would have been. I replied briefly, confirming receipt and suggesting we discuss details in person, and when we did meet at the kitchen table that evening, the conversation remained focused, measured, and calm. She spoke about fairness, about wanting to ensure neither of us felt disadvantaged, and I realized she had already positioned herself mentally beyond the relationship, negotiating terms rather than revisiting history. At one point during that discussion, her phone lit up on the counter, and I caught a glimpse of a notification with the name Daniel Brooks again, brief and unintentional, and I noticed how she did not react to it at all, as if that name now belonged to a different layer of her life that no longer required explanation. I did not mention it, because by then I understood that mentioning things did not create clarity. It only delayed what was already inevitable. After she left the room, I stayed behind longer than necessary, looking at the space where she had been sitting, noticing how quickly familiarity can become absence without changing the physical environment at all. I began to think less about what had happened and more about what had been quietly shifting underneath everything for months without my full awareness. There was no single moment I could point to as the beginning of the end, only a series of adjustments that now looked like preparation in hindsight. That night, I opened my laptop and reviewed my own financial records out of habit rather than intent, scanning through accounts, investments, and old transactions, and somewhere in that process I paused briefly on an entry I had not thought about in years: a small early investment made into a startup tied to a business acquaintance I had once believed in more casually than strategically. I did not think much of it at the time, and I closed the file without attaching meaning to it, but the act of remembering lingered in the background of my thoughts longer than expected. When I finally went to bed, the house felt less like it was emptying and more like it was being carefully restructured, and I understood that what remained between Olivia and me was no longer relationship in any active sense, but only the final administrative distance required to complete the separation of two lives that had already stopped moving in the same direction. The days after she moved out did not feel like an ending at first. They felt like an adjustment to a quieter version of the same life, as if the volume had simply been turned down rather than the channel changed entirely. Olivia left on a Saturday morning without ceremony, taking only what she considered necessary, and the absence she created did not echo in dramatic ways, but settled instead into the corners of the house like dust that refused to be noticed all at once. I watched from the kitchen as she carried the last of her bags to her car, and there was no pause, no final glance that suggested hesitation. Only a steady continuation of a decision already fully integrated into her sense of direction. When the engine started and she drove away, there was no emotional collapse, only a strange clarity that arrived afterward, the kind that replaces expectation when it is no longer needed. The house did not feel empty immediately. It felt reorganized, as if her presence had been removed from the structure but not yet replaced with anything new. In the following days, communication shifted entirely into scheduled necessity, messages about accounts, confirmations of details, and short exchanges that contained no emotional residue. I began sleeping more consistently, not because I was at peace, but because there was nothing left to anticipate in the same way there used to be. Work filled most of my daytime hours, and I noticed I was no longer distracted by trying to interpret the emotional weather of a life I was no longer actively inside of. Yet in the quiet moments, when routine stopped occupying my attention, I found myself returning to patterns I had not fully examined before, small inconsistencies in timing, references, and the way certain names had entered Olivia's vocabulary in the months leading up to her departure. Daniel Brooks was no longer just a name mentioned casually in conversation. He had become a point of reference that seemed to anchor decisions she made without me. One afternoon, while reviewing older financial summaries for reasons I could not clearly define, I found myself scrolling further back than usual into records that belonged to a different phase of my professional life, a period when I had made small, calculated investments into early-stage companies through a network that no longer existed in its original form. Most of those investments had been passive, almost forgettable at the time, chosen more out of curiosity than strategy, and I had not revisited them in years. One entry caught my attention longer than the others, a small investment into a technology startup that had been struggling at the time, led by a founder whose name I now recognized as indirectly connected to Daniel Brooks through later business summaries I had seen in passing. I did not immediately assign meaning to it, because patterns without context often create false conclusions, and I had learned to avoid interpreting coincidence as intention. Still, the thought lingered longer than expected, not as certainty, but as a faint structural possibility I could not yet dismiss. Meanwhile, Olivia's life outside the house appeared to accelerate in ways I only observed indirectly through fragments, occasional updates tied to legal formalities or mutual obligations, and brief glimpses of public information that surfaced without effort. Daniel Brooks was beginning to appear more frequently in business circles that intersected with sectors I understood, described in articles and summaries as someone experiencing rapid upward momentum, and while none of this directly involved me, I could not ignore the subtle alignment of timelines. It was not that I was looking for meaning in every detail, but rather that meaning was beginning to form without being actively pursued. One evening, I received a brief message from Olivia confirming that remaining paperwork would be handled through attorneys, and there was nothing emotional in the wording, only procedural closure. I replied in kind, keeping the tone equally neutral, and after sending it, I realized how efficiently two people could reduce an entire shared history into structured communication without any visible breakdown. That night, I sat alone in the living room longer than usual, not thinking about the past in emotional terms, but reconstructing it in terms of sequence and cause. I began to understand that the version of Olivia who had left was not created suddenly, but assembled gradually through a series of influences and decisions that had slowly reoriented her sense of direction away from our shared center. At some point, I opened my laptop again and revisited the same financial record I had seen days earlier, focusing this time not on the investment itself, but on the timeline that followed it, tracing how the company had evolved, who had entered leadership roles, and how capital flows had shifted over time. The connection was still not fully defined, but the structure of it was becoming harder to dismiss as random. Daniel Brooks, in the public record, was now associated with the kind of financial growth that suggested acceleration rather than stability, and I found myself wondering less about his presence in Olivia's life and more about the underlying mechanisms that had shaped his trajectory. What I did not yet fully articulate, even to myself, was that influence often travels invisibly until it produces visible outcomes, and by the time those outcomes are recognized, the original point of contact has already been forgotten. As I closed my laptop that night, I did not reach any conclusion, but I also did not return to uncertainty in the same way I had before, because something in the pattern had begun to repeat too consistently to ignore, and I understood that whatever truth was forming, it was not arriving as a revelation, but as an accumulation of details that had been present all along, waiting to be connected. The realization did not come as a single breakthrough, but as a series of quiet confirmations that stacked on top of each other until ignoring them required more effort than acknowledging them. After several days of trying to dismiss the pattern I had noticed, I found myself returning to my older financial records again, not out of emotional impulse, but out of a growing need for structural clarity. The same kind of clarity I used to rely on when solving complex system problems at work. I opened archived files from years earlier, back when I had been involved in small-scale, early-stage investments through a professional network that no longer existed in its original form, and I began tracing entries with a level of attention I had never applied to them at the time. Most of them were unremarkable in isolation, small allocations into companies that had either dissolved or remained stagnant, the kind of financial decisions that rarely carried long-term emotional weight. But one entry kept drawing my attention back, a technology startup that had been operating on the edge of viability during its earliest phase, led by a founder whose name now appeared in more recent business summaries tied indirectly to Daniel Brooks. At first, the connection still felt too thin to assign meaning to, because correlation without confirmation is often just noise, and I had no interest in constructing narratives out of coincidence. Still, I continued following the thread, opening related documents, reading old correspondence, reviewing investment summaries that I had not revisited in years. The deeper I looked, the more the timeline began to align in ways that were difficult to ignore. The startup had been struggling when I first invested, operating with limited capital and uncertain direction, and my contribution, while not large in absolute terms, had been part of a foundational funding stage that allowed the company to stabilize long enough to attract additional investors later. According to later documentation, Daniel Brooks had entered the picture during a subsequent restructuring phase, acquiring a significant role after early validation had already been established. That validation, according to the records, had been heavily influenced by the initial stability provided by early investors, including my own participation. I sat with that information longer than I expected, not because it was emotionally overwhelming, but because it reframed something I had not previously considered as connected to my present life. If the timeline was accurate, then Daniel Brooks had not simply appeared as an independent force of success, but had grown within a structure that had been partially enabled by early financial foundations I had helped support without ever attaching personal significance to it. I cross-referenced names, dates, and funding rounds, moving between documents with increasing focus, and each layer of verification reduced the space for ambiguity. There was still no direct personal link between me and Olivia's decision, at least none that I could confirm through emotional interpretation, but structurally, the overlap between past investment activity and current business outcomes involving Daniel Brooks was no longer something I could dismiss as unrelated. I began to understand that influence in financial systems rarely remains visible at the surface level. It propagates through stages, often detaching itself from its origin point before becoming recognizable in its final form. At some point during that evening, I stopped trying to force immediate meaning from the discovery and instead focused on reconstructing the sequence of events with precision, treating it less like a personal revelation and more like a system map that required proper interpretation. The more I examined it, the more I saw that Daniel Brooks' rise was not a singular trajectory, but a layered one, shaped by early constraints, external validation, and capital infusions that had created momentum before visibility ever reached my awareness. And somewhere within that structure, my own past decisions existed as one of the contributing elements, not in a direct or controlling sense, but as part of the foundation that had allowed subsequent outcomes to develop. I did not yet fully understand what this meant in relation to Olivia, but I could no longer ignore that her perception of Daniel Brooks as someone who embodied independent success was only partially aligned with the underlying architecture of how that success had formed. That evening, I closed the files and sat in silence longer than usual, not because I felt confusion, but because I was processing a shift in perspective that recontextualized more than just one person or one decision. It made me reconsider how many other elements in my life had operated in the background without my active recognition, how many outcomes I had influenced indirectly without ever seeing their final expression. For the first time since Olivia had left, I was not focused on the absence itself, but on the invisible structures that had continued to operate beneath it. and I began to suspect that the full picture of what had happened between us was still incomplete, not because information was missing, but because I had not yet understood how deeply interconnected the past and present truly were. The morning after I finished reviewing the deeper layers of the investment records, I woke up with a different kind of attention, not emotional urgency, but analytical focus, as if my mind had shifted into a mode that prioritized structure over feeling. I made coffee and sat at the kitchen table where so many conversations with Olivia had ended in silence, and I reopened the files again, this time with a more deliberate intention to trace not just isolated data points, but the complete sequence of value creation from beginning to present. What I had previously seen as a minor early-stage investment now appeared within a larger framework that I had not fully reconstructed before. The startup in question had not simply survived its early phase. It had transitioned through a structured funding progression that included multiple rounds of capital injection, strategic partnerships, and eventual integration into a larger financial portfolio that significantly increased its market visibility. As I followed the documentation chronologically, I began to see how the early instability of the company had been stabilized by initial funding that allowed it to reach a critical development threshold, after which external leadership and restructuring accelerated its growth trajectory. In those early records, my name appeared among a small group of contributors whose combined investment formed the foundation that prevented the company from collapsing during its most fragile stage. At the time, I had not attached personal significance to that decision, treating it as one of many calculated risks within a diversified approach to financial planning. But now, viewing it in reverse, I could see how that initial stabilization created the conditions for everything that followed. Daniel Brooks' name appeared later in the timeline, not at the origin point, but during a phase where the company had already been prepared for expansion. According to internal summaries and publicly available investor reports, his entry coincided with a restructuring phase that allowed him to take on a visible leadership role, and from that point forward, the company's valuation increased at a significantly accelerated rate. I leaned back in my chair and let the information sit without immediate interpretation, because I had learned that rushing to meaning often distorts structure. Instead, I focused on verifying consistency across multiple documents, cross-checking dates, funding rounds, and leadership transitions until the pattern stabilized into something coherent. The conclusion was not speculative, it was procedural. The financial foundation that had enabled Daniel Brooks' rise included early capital contributions that I had been part of, even if indirectly in terms of intention. What I had not anticipated was how that structure would eventually intersect with my personal life in a way that recontextualized everything I thought I understood about separation and distance. That afternoon, I received a brief update through formal channels indicating that Olivia's relocation process had been finalized, and while the message contained no emotional language, I understood its implications immediately. She was now officially separated in both legal and practical terms, and according to indirect updates I had seen through shared networks, she had transitioned into living arrangements aligned with Daniel Brooks' current lifestyle, which reflected a level of financial stability that had not existed in his earlier professional history. I did not interpret this as coincidence anymore, not in the casual sense, because the alignment of timelines had become too consistent to dismiss. Instead, I began to see it as a layered system where past decisions, made without emotional weight, had produced outcomes that now intersected with present emotional consequences. The irony was not immediate in an emotional sense, but structural. The man Olivia had chosen as a symbol of upward mobility was operating within a trajectory that had been partially enabled by the very financial foundation I had contributed to years earlier without ever assigning meaning to it. I did not feel anger when I recognized this, only a deepening sense of how interconnected systems can remain invisible until their outcomes converge. Later that evening, I accessed a consolidated investor report that provided a clearer breakdown of equity distribution over time, and there it was in unambiguous form. The early-stage capital contribution that had stabilized the company, followed by subsequent valuation increases that directly benefited all later stakeholders, including Daniel Brooks in his current position. The numbers themselves were not emotionally charged, but their implications created a structural inversion that could not be ignored. What had once been perceived externally as individual success was now clearly a layered outcome built on sequential dependency, and at the base layer of that sequence, my own decision existed as a contributing factor. I closed the report and sat in silence for a long time, not because I was overwhelmed, but because I was recalibrating how I understood causality in relation to personal history. Olivia's departure, which I had initially processed as an emotional separation, now existed within a broader framework that included financial history, timing, and indirect influence chains that neither of us had consciously considered. I realized that while she had made her decision based on what she believed was independent success on the other side, the structure she was moving into was not as independent as it appeared. And yet, even with that realization, I did not feel compelled to act or respond, because the situation no longer existed within a space where reaction was meaningful. Instead, it existed as a completed sequence of events whose full architecture was only now becoming visible in retrospect. That night, as I prepared to sleep, I understood something that had been forming quietly throughout this entire process, that lives do not separate cleanly at the moment of decision. They separate gradually through layers of unseen connections that only become visible when traced backward far enough to reveal their origin points. In the days that followed, everything began to settle into a quiet finality that no longer felt like change, but completion, as if the last unresolved variables in a long equation had finally been accounted for and the result had already been determined. I stopped revisiting the files as frequently, not because the pattern had disappeared, but because it had stabilized into something that no longer required constant verification. The structure of Daniel Brooks' rise, the early financial foundation I had contributed to, and the eventual convergence of his success with Olivia's new life all existed now as a closed system in my mind, one that no longer evolved but simply remained observable from different angles. Olivia and I communicated only when necessary, and even then, the tone remained consistent, neutral, and procedural, as if we had both agreed without discussion that emotional interpretation was no longer part of our shared language. One afternoon, I received the final legal confirmation that the separation process had been fully completed, and the document itself was devoid of sentiment, containing only formal statements, timestamps, and structured closure. I read it once, set it down, and realized there was nothing inside me that resisted it anymore. It did not feel like loss in the way I once would have defined it, but rather like the conclusion of a system that had reached equilibrium after all variables had resolved their interactions. Later that evening, I found myself standing in the kitchen longer than usual, not doing anything, not thinking in a directed way, just observing the space that had once held a shared life. The absence of Olivia was no longer something that demanded attention. It had become part of the architecture of the house, like a structural change that had been fully integrated into its design. I thought about the sequence of events again, not with emotional weight, but with clarity, and I understood that what had appeared to be a sudden departure had actually been a gradual relocation of intention long before any formal decision had been spoken aloud. Daniel Brooks, the trajectory of his career, the financial systems that supported his rise, and my own early involvement in those systems now existed in my understanding as interconnected layers of a process I had never fully seen while it was unfolding. And yet, even with that awareness, I felt no urge to rewrite meaning or assign blame, because the more I examined it, the more it became clear that each element had followed its own internal logic without requiring awareness from the others. Olivia had chosen a direction based on what she perceived as momentum. Daniel Brooks had followed a trajectory shaped by opportunity and timing, and I had participated in an early phase of a structure without knowing its eventual form. None of it had been orchestrated in the way people often assume when looking backward for coherence, but instead it had emerged through independent decisions that only later intersected. A few days after receiving the final confirmation, I reviewed my remaining financial positions one last time, not out of necessity, but out of habit, and I noticed how detached I had become from outcomes that once carried emotional significance. There was a clarity in that detachment that felt unfamiliar but not uncomfortable, as if I had moved beyond a threshold where personal narrative no longer depended on external validation. I did not hear from Olivia again except through brief administrative exchanges, and even those became increasingly rare until they stopped entirely. Life returned to a quieter rhythm, not empty, but unstructured in a way that no longer required interpretation. I began focusing more on work, not as distraction, but as function, and found that my attention, once fragmented by uncertainty, now remained steady for longer periods without drifting into analysis of what had already concluded. Occasionally, I would think about how easily meaning is constructed after outcomes are known, how the mind naturally organizes past events into patterns that appear intentional even when they were not designed as such. The investment I had made years earlier, the rise of Daniel Brooks, and Olivia's eventual decision all remained part of the same timeline, but I no longer experienced them as connected in the emotional sense I once had. Instead, they existed as separate sequences that had intersected temporarily before continuing along their own paths. One evening, as I sat alone and looked out across the quiet street outside my window, I realized that nothing in the sequence had required my understanding for it to unfold, and that realization did not feel like closure or revelation, but simply acknowledgement of how systems, both financial and personal, often operate beyond the perception of those who are inside them. In the end, what remained was not a question of who caused what, but an understanding that every decision carries forward consequences that may only become visible when viewed from a distance far enough removed from emotion to see structure instead of story.